welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here. We are coming together to launch a new report that the World Bank has pulled together on keys to energy efficient shipping. And our plan here today is effectively to run through some of the key findings of the report, which will be followed up by a panel where we have several leaders with us in form of Dieleman from Cargill and Berte from Port of Rotterdam to discuss some of those findings in real life, I guess. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Jan Hoffmann and Sophie Parker from the World Bank, who are the lead authors of this report. If I can hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Thank you, Global Maritime Forum. By way of introduction, when you read our report, you will probably be reminded of the classical economist joke. There's the professor, the student walking in the street, and the student says, "Professor, professor, there's a $20 note on the floor." The professor says, "Can't be. Somebody would have picked it up." So in our report, you will see $20 notes, and we will discuss how we can pick them up, how we can find them, and whether they're $5 notes or $20 notes. And my colleague, Dr. Sophie Parker, will present the role of information, of data, coordination, so-called split incentives, and to help you find and pick up the $20 notes. Second of my 3 points by way of introduction, we started this report actually almost 3 years ago. So the timing right now is of course fantastic. It's very timely, very important, but it is really a coincidence and should not be linked to we are lucky to be here at the GMF, but the timing and the plan is it matters now, and it matters more and more in future. With or without a multilateral agreement, or if and when this happens. Third and last but not least, by way of introduction, the data that Sophie will present, it's not forecasts, it is really potential. No? It's potential if it's a $20 note or a $5 note, whether we can find it or not, and how to pick it up. One important point I want to make by way of introduction, over time, these energy efficiency measures, the potential, will go up. Because as we use e-fuels and different fuels and more expensive fuels, it's getting even more important. So it is not just to save fuel and reduce emissions today, but it's also to make the alternative fuels, the future fuels, more viable. That's all my 3 points of introduction. Thank you very much, my dear colleague, Dr. Sophie Parker, who came over from London. Thank you also to the panelists who will join us afterwards for discussion. And thank you, Global Maritime Forum. Thank you very much. So, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Jan. Okay, so solutions to decarbonizing the shipping industry often focus on creating a market for new green fuels. Since we are actually in the press room, we wanted to test this hypothesis out and see if this is actually reflected in the shipping press. So searching for articles on fuels and climate compared to keywords on energy efficiency and climate, we find that this is actually the case. The shipping press is focusing on fuels. However, today I want to refocus our attention on energy efficiency. And that is because it has significant potential to reduce emissions and cut costs. So the report unpacks the contribution of energy efficiency through 4 key questions. The first is what could be energy efficiency's contribution to the IMO targets. The second is how cost-effective are the measures. Third, will it reduce the cost of the fuel transition out to 2050? And finally, what are the remaining barriers, and what do we do about them to maximize energy efficiency in shipping? We looked at a number of energy efficiency scenarios in order to quantify the reductions that could be made. Now here we show the maximum energy efficiency pathway out to 2050. And what we find is in 2030, up to about 40% of emissions can be reduced with energy efficiency alone. So we assume nothing happens to the future fuel mix, so we can just simply isolate energy efficiency. However, if we go out to 2050, you can see here by the blue line that clearly energy efficiency can't decarbonize the shipping industry. Okay? The IMO's targets get more stringent, and so energy efficiency still has a role to play, but we do need green fuels. And in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about how cost-effective energy efficiency is. So we use, We use what's called marginal abatement cost curves to actually assess the cost-effectiveness of individual energy efficiency measures. So marginal abatement cost curve, all it does is looks at the emissions abatement compared to how much it would cost or save for each measure. And what we find is that, as you can see here on the left, approximately half of the emissions saved can be cut at no cost when we compare it to the fuel cost that can be saved. And in 2030, which is what we show here, the largest individual potential is speed reduction. Now, this takes into account that we need to add ships to the fleet because as the ships slow down, they can't meet the same transport demand. Now, this is a conservative estimate because we don't take into account that there are large ports which still practice sail fast, then wait at port practices. And so there could be additional savings made in those ports by just optimizing efficiency in port. So will energy efficiency reduce the cost of fuel transition? This is something we were interested in actually quantifying. So we looked at a scenario where ships can only use green fuels, and then we compared that to a scenario where we combine green fuels with energy efficiency measures to reduce the fuel consumption. What we find is that the savings that can be made is up to $220 billion, and that's shown here in 2040. But savings can be made in all years due to the savings on fuel costs relative to the cost of CapEx for these energy efficiency measures. So what do we do about the remaining barriers that persist in energy efficiency and that dollar bill on the ground? How do we pick that up? So we've surveyed the literature again, found economic barriers, behavioral barriers, and organizational barriers. We also, in the report, deep dive on two promising measures, so wind-assisted propulsion and port call optimization. And for wind assist, we find that mainly these are economic barriers. Shown here, I'm just highlighting imperfect information because we don't currently have one standardized methodology to measure those savings. We get a wide range of savings also due to ship type and route. And a sort of standardized methodology would be helpful for a ship owner to actually understand those savings for their ship and their route. On the port call optimization side, we find that behavioral and organizational barriers are a problem. Now, a recent survey looked at asking ships and ports about what the barriers were, and the second most highly cited barrier was a lack of willingness to change. This is very important for ports where they need to standardize timestamps in order to optimize port operations. Also, power balance issues, especially acute in ports around the world, which are normally landlord ports, where you have a division between the terminal operator, which is privately owned, runs the berth planning, on the other side, the port authority, which wants to do something about the problem. Okay, finally, who can help address these barriers? We identified 4 key stakeholders: policymakers, industry, ports, and financiers. Shown here are just some examples of solutions. You can find a wider discussion in our report. For policymakers, advancing performance standards will continue to be key to reducing emissions, and it's particularly for energy efficiency measures, which have been the backbone of the IMOs, so strengthening EEDI and CII, for example. Industry, I mentioned that we have that wide range of savings. We need to foster demonstration projects with third-party verified information to give confidence to the market. For ports, adopting digital data standards is important for optimizing the voyage all the way into port and lowering that speed on the voyage and not just a couple hours into port, which is the current practice. And then finally, innovating risk management, so financing products is important. This is already starting to happen. We see pay as you save, for example. Here we just are discussing the importance of financing products which incorporate the fact that there's a split incentive between the owner, which doesn't always benefit from the savings, and the charter, on the other hand, in the time charter market. Okay, my final slide is to give you some key takeaways. So up to about 40% of GHG emissions can be cut by 2030. Half of GHG emission savings are cost-effective, 2030. Up to 220 billion can be saved in the fuel transition, and stakeholders can and should act to overcome the barriers. And you can find a report with this QR code, and there's a postcard as well on your table. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. We now have a few industry speakers who, if I can invite you to come join me on the stage. We have Berte Simmons, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the Port of Rotterdam, where, of course, you're innovating some of these things that we just talked about. And we have Dieleman, who's the President of Cargill Ocean Transport, where you're investing quite heavily into these technologies. And so what I wanted to do, I believe there's one more slide with our... Oh. There we go. What I wanted to do was really turn this into real life. So we heard some of the research that the World Bank has done in this space, but what does that really mean? The technology seems to be there. Some pilots are taking place, but it's just not scaling. So what does that really mean? And so I wanted to start off on the sort of commercial case for emission efficiency. And Jan, we just heard how in the report that half of the emission saving from energy efficiency measures are already cost effective. Yep. Talking about the business case, it's there. So from Cargill's perspective, what makes these investments compelling and what holds the sector back?
Yeah, now first of all, I would like to congratulate the World Bank because I think it's a really good report and really shines on the right things. And specifically given what's happened last week in the IMO, I think the importance of energy saving cannot be underestimated, because it's something that we can do right here, right now. I always say that in the end of the day, the cheapest fuel, because we're always talking about the cost of fuel, is the fuel that you don't burn, right? So the business case is very clear. I think where we've had some issues initially was technical feasibility of some of these things. You have sometimes vendors that oversell a little bit the performance, and I think the only way to find out is to trial and just take some risk. So there's a technical thing that you have to get used to, and then I think in the end of the day, if you get that right, the business case is there, and if you look at some of the paybacks of some of those investments, they are actually really, really good. We are now getting into the next phase, I would say. There was wind was in there. We've done a lot on wind. We have 3 different types of wind on the water today. Now the big question is, how are some of these energy-saving technologies working in tandem? Yeah. So what is the one plus the other? Can you just add them up, or can you not? And that is the game that we're having today. So I think we got very comfortable in that. I think the setup of the industry, mainly on the tramping and bulk side, where you have a very fragmented industry, you have the problem that the one that is making the investment is not necessarily the one that pays the fuel bill. So you have to somehow make sure that you connect the two. And we've taken the approach that if we are the one paying the fuel bill, we are more than happy to co-invest or sometimes fully invest in the asset and just take that risk on ourselves. So I think that's been holding back a little bit the industry. I do think people are getting more confident that this actually works. People start understanding the business case. I think that is happening. I think now it's just the mechanisms on how you share benefits and risks is something that is being sorted out as we speak.
Yes. Also something that we're working together on, actually, yes, for that matter. But if I can just hone in a little bit in form of some of the solid wind trials, solid wind sail trials, sorry, that you've had. What really sparked that to go ahead in your company?
Yeah, so some of these things, you know, they just happen. We were in touch on wind before, and I think I've said this before. We trialed with wind 15, 20 years ago, and it didn't work. And at some point we said, but there must be something. And we actually reached out to this company that was actually doing professional racing of sailboats. And we said, okay, let's talk together on what we can do. And then they come up with this concept. And we said, you know what, let's give it a try. And that's what we did. We learned a lot. We also learned that some of the issues are sometimes not to do with the technology, but sometimes it's actually port acceptance. Because if you come in with a wing of 38 meters, that is not something that ports are used to. So there is some of these things that you have to iron out. And I think also what comes back in this report here, it's the behavioral question, right? And I think we very quickly went on, let's give it a go. And the worst that can happen is that it doesn't work. And we know our downside, and we're happy with the downside. And from that one wind, we actually started to test different types of technology. And I think what really excites me is that at the moment you're seeing really innovation on innovation. And the wind that people are looking at today is already much better than the wind that people were looking at 3-4 years ago. So I think there's a huge benefit of being there. And we just took a risk, and I would encourage other people to do the same.
Yes. And you already sort of talked about the sort of other end of this when somebody arrives with a great big sail on their ship. From the port's perspective, Berte, you know, ports are a critical element of the transition. From your vantage point in Rotterdam, how can ports really actively drive the energy efficiency part of it, not just within the gates as such, but also beyond the whole voyage, and you know, digitalization space, better coordination, incentives. What is it from the port perspective that can drive this forward?
Yeah, let me first echo what Jan said. We're very pleased with the World Bank report released today, given we're in a lot of turmoil, not only in our industry, but globally. It's very key to keep our eye on the goal. For us, contributing to all of these ambitions that we have is really our commitment to net zero in 2050, and that will go beyond our gates. We are the largest port in Europe, the second largest bunkering port in the world. We have a responsibility and a commitment to make that better and to push innovation. We're looking at various things. Obviously, there's a role that a port has to play in supporting new innovations, but also developing and especially adoption of new technologies in our port. And that then comes to very practical things such as where can we do that safely? How can we develop frameworks for that? How can we allow that to happen? We have a very can-do mentality. It will not say that we do not have some of these behavioral barriers, as was mentioned in the report. I think that has much more to do with all these various players in this space who have various different business models, different relationships with each other. You need to allow everybody time to make the transition. It's not going to be beneficial if one of the partners holding a piece of the puzzle is just going to drop out because it's not going to be economical for them. So we're very careful about that. We're focused on having pilots, learning from that. And I think, for example, digitization, and digitization is not only AI. AI will definitely help us. But in the maritime industry, and you probably all know this, we're conventional in some ways, so it starts with data sharing. It sounds very easy to share data, but we can only learn if we have more insight in data, if we share it more, and if we're also seeing benefits in looking into especially each other's assumptions. So, for example, what was mentioned in the report, we can save a lot of the fuel that we don't use, as Jan said. That's fuel that you don't burn, for example, sailing slower. It's quite some assumptions for all these key players in the shipping industry in why do you have to be on time, why do you have to speed up or not, you're always waiting there, or you're never waiting there, or you're probably going to be too late. These are all assumptions. If you do not test them and share those insights, it's going to be hard to debottleneck. So we're very much focused on seeing the details of, for example, who's waiting for who has contracts with what other companies, and where are the drivers that we can influence, what kind of incentives are going to be helpful, and from an operational perspective, if you look at port call optimization, everybody who's involved in this value chain obviously wants to do this more efficient. It's going to save everyone money, but we need to have quite an open conversation on where does that sit.
And talking about the digitalization and the sharing out of the benefits as such that comes with this, how does the digitalization aspect help to bring some of these commercial benefits or make them tangible for the port? What does that look like in form of the savings that are being generated there?
Yeah, so for example, we have the Green Corridor partnership with the Port of Singapore, where we are very clear on our ambition that we would like to support the maritime industry on using cleaner fuels. How are we going to make that happen? That means that they can practically do that. But then at the same time, on top of that, so that is a real process, so to say. And then on top of that, we're sharing data insights on how much fuel is used, what is actually the sailing time, what does it mean if you reduce sailing time, and then when you enter either of the ports, what is the process there? And there is a lot about the time windows that we use and who sits on what type of information. We obviously have all kinds of regulations that's across the globe on when you have to report when you're actually entering a port and dealings with customs, etc. But allowing to open and widen the time windows of sharing information and then optimizing that, that's where a real benefit sits. And that will reduce clearly emissions when you look into our gate, between our gates. So if we look at our own area where we want to have a direct reduce of emissions of CO2 in our own port area where we are responsible, and where we obviously also are looking into how do we deal with local communities and make sure that towards 2050 people are going to be supportive of industry and port activities. But furthermore, we're extending that beyond our gates and sharing those time windows and opening that up in terms of shippers and then cargo owners to have that commercial debate in terms of what kind of contracts do we actually have with each other? Are these actually the incentives that we need? Is this a proper risk sharing when we want to move into transition?
Yeah, important. Both of you have now talked about this communication, open channels, and so there's something about this culture and collaboration aspect that's critical within this. Jan, within your organization, it's a huge company. You have different desks with different priorities. You have, on the one side, trading desks for the cargo, for the ships, the sustainability teams. How are you, sort of, as a leader, I guess, encouraging that collaboration across the teams, optimizing both the commercial performance but also the efficiency? And what have you learned from that alignment work, I guess?
Yeah, no, you always have people with different focus areas and they're not always aligned, and you have to find the alignment, and I think that's where leadership comes in, I think. I think what we wanted to do is create the kind of a culture of can-do and learning, and actually there's a lot of positive feedback from that, because it's actually pretty cool to be going to a party and say that you're kind of working with one of the racing teams on wind, right? So there's a lot of these things that is actually quite exciting for people. We actually had people that called us up and wanted to join us because of what we were doing. So you have that group, it's great. I think then what you can do here, and this is what I like also about this report, if you're telling a trader that he or she can save money, all of a sudden the discussion becomes very easy, right? So if you can put this into real money, and that's why I think data is so important, data on the ports, data on the technology, if you can show and you can prove that this is saving money, you're not going to get a lot of opposition from people on the concept. Now, I think what we're having, and that I think was mentioned here earlier as well, we have some misalignment sometimes with contractual terms, and I think the majority of that is not coming only from shipping, but also very much from the commodities that we ship. So you have the commodity contract that might not be rewritten for the last 25 years, and you're sitting with this new normal in maritime that is not fit for purpose anymore. So I think we need an overhaul of some of these contractual terms to make sure that these savings actually also pass through to some of those players, because then I think you get them on board. But I think economic incentives, when you can show that you have a business case, it goes a long way of getting people aligned.
I've just been told that we have a few minutes left, so one final version of your side of this this argument of aligning and making sure that different players get what they need out of these trials and demonstrations. You guys have had port call optimization pilots in the port, and you're driving that forward. What's working? What's not working? Where do we need to sort of focus going forward?
Well, what's working is having pilots, and we'll need to continue to do so for quite some time. We're also amending some of our port practices together with some of the other service providers, for example, pilots or tugboats, as well as terminals, of course, and agents, shipping agents. So you need to pilot it. This is not going to work to sort of sit hypothetically around the table and then stare each other in the eyes and say, well, we all want to go to net zero. A lot of us are going to be retired by the time it's 2050. Then it's a little too late to action something. So you need to have some KPI, some action in your books for 2026. Whether you need to have budget to it or not, you definitely need to have resources to it. And say, this is going to be what I'm going to do different next year. I probably need a few others. It would also allow you to be in the game. The ones who are not going to pilot and not going to try, there's going to be a turning point when you don't want to be on the sideline. You want to be in the team that is not only doing this for very good reasons in terms of decarbonisation, but just the ones who have figured out first and foremost to do this more cost effectively, because ultimately it has to be economical for everyone. So you don't want to be missing out on that.
Very, very wise words there. So I think we will open for questions, and I believe that there is online questions and potentially here in the room.
I was wondering, of the 3 barriers that the World Bank outlined, which one is the hardest nut to crack, and how could you crack the nut, so to speak?
The way I would look at it is probably behavioral, because some of these behaviors have been ingrained for a long time, and this is quite, I would call it a traditional industry. I think you use a slightly different word. But I think that is the thing that is difficult. And I think the other 2 you can align, right? If you can show economic viability, you can put the numbers, you can do that. You can organize yourself in a way to get the best out of it. It might not happen overnight, but you can actually do that. But changing someone's behavior is a lot more difficult, I think.
Yeah, I think to add to that, you need to understand that this is a very capital-intensive industry, especially for the shipping lines. So it's they need to have a perspective in terms of what transition will mean to them. It's not like a digital innovation that you can try on people's iPhone and you can launch it and you can have a new POC tomorrow. You build a vessel, you need to sail for it for many years. That's also what we want them to do. So it's very important to have that perspective as well.
Different lead times, yep, I agree.
Okay. I have another question, if not anywhere else. I think from my perspective, the behavioral part requires this kind of open dialogue, right? And I think I would love to hear both of your perspectives on whether you think these relationships between ports and ship operators as such will change, and what that might look like, as we're both striving towards this sort of shared goal of shared benefits.
What I observe in the whole kind of maritime supply chain, I would call it, because sometimes I think we're talking too much about maritime as something on its own, but in the end we're serving other supply chains, right? So we're part of a bigger puzzle that also wants to decarbonize, most likely. So I think here the boundaries are very much changing. If I look ourselves 5-10 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about operational efficiencies. We wouldn't talk about port optimization because there was somebody else's job. But nowadays, all these things start being connected, and if you want to make a difference, you cannot just stay in your own swim lane, because you kind of have to also have the other one helping you. So the relationship that we have with ports have changed. In some ports, we're getting discounts because we're coming in with the wind ships and some other things. We're having active discussions with that, which we would never have. We're having discussions with owners where we're saying, you know what, we're willing to co-invest. Actually, we're having owners now coming to us and saying, you know what, you guys seem to know a lot about energy efficiency. Can you help me in my choices? So if you would have asked me that we would have been in this position 5 years ago, I would probably look you in the eyes and say, what are you talking about? So I think all these relationships are changing, and I think it's all because you need everyone on board to make a difference. You can't just do this in a silo. And that's exactly also the spirit that we have as the Global Maritime Forum. I think where you're trying to put the whole supply chain together and make progress that way, and not just in your little silo.
Yeah, and I would like to build on that. I think also the role of the end customer is becoming increasingly important. We see that within the value chain, this was in some parts it was siloed, and there was also not always access to this end customer. I truly believe that an end customer has a responsibility when it comes to decarbonization. And okay, it's mentioned already a few times here, no shipping, no shopping, but as an individual, you have a responsibility in terms of what you buy, where it's from, and how it's transported. It's something that, for our generation, we really need to take an interest. And then, in terms of building these new value chains, of getting these different ways of operating off the ground, you need to have a launching base, and that launching base will always be across the value chain, and that needs to have a part of risk sharing, benefit sharing, and a common view. So I see a lot of much more moving together and being able to commit to similar goals.
I will pause if there's any other questions. Not at the minute. I will keep going because I have plenty. In form of, or rather, we're here at the annual summit for the Global Maritime Forum in Antwerp. The culture here is always to ask, well, what is it that we actually need to do? Because what I'm hearing both of you say is the case is there, you know, the conversations are happening in part now. So what is it that actually is really holding this back? So if we had to come up with an actual practical action to drive this forward, if we're making a target for 2026, you know, for operational efficiency to become, or rather efficiency measures to become more scaled, what would be the sort of the key thing that, from an industry perspective, from a sort of, what would be the thing that we need to do?
Well, I think we have a unique opportunity, to be honest, at the moment, because of what happened last week. I think there's a lot of questions on where you're going to invest in again, because new fuels and all these things. And so I can understand that people are not going to double down on some of the net zero fuels with the situation we're in. However, if you're looking at energy efficiency, even on the existing fleet, the business case is there. So there is no reason to hold back on that one. And actually, there's only an upside, because if we do get the zero fuels, or we're getting a carbon levy or whatever it is, your payback is only going to get better. So I think we just need to keep on putting that business case out to the wider group. I think we need to work a lot on real data on some of these technologies, I would say mainly, on what is real. And then I think with that, we're going to get the confidence of people that this actually works and this is actually a good business to be in. And I think if we can get to that narrative, I think we're going to see a lot of adoption. And yes, we have some issues and who pays and who this, but I think in the end of the day, we'll overcome those.
Yeah. So communication. Back
yes,
to,
I think
back
that's
to
what it is.
narrative
I think what it is. I think what it is.
Yeah, I think that there's a clear need to stick to the goals that we have set out, and I think last week has been, at least for some of us, feels as a setback, but that is something I would say is temporary. The larger changes and movements are not stopping because they have already started. So how do we get to scale might be slower, but it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And we have to keep demonstrating that this is the way forward, and you can only do that by actioning it. So that would be my my call to action.
So do it and talk about it. The two things to
show it.
Show it and talk about it.
Take a bit of risk at times, right? Because this is a market that is very happy to take risk financially and all these things, and then it gets to technology, and then people are all getting scared. And I'm like, okay, well, what's the difference? The worst, it doesn't work, or it doesn't pencil out like you thought. That's okay. You learn it, move on, then try something else.
That sounds good to me. And with that, I think we will take this to a close. Thank you all very much for participating, and wishing you a good rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you very much.